It is my pleasure to introduce the outstanding witnesses on this second panel. To my left, your right, we have with us Ms. Adrienne Sheed, is that correct? Sheed Rothkopf. Ms. Rothkopf is the Vice President of the Western Hemisphere Affairs Division of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And next to Ms. Rothkopf, we have with us Mr. Jeff Thale. Is that how? Thale, I'm sorry. Mr. Jeff Thale, who is the Program Director for the Washington Office on Latin America. And next to Mr. Thale is Mr. Kirby Jones. And Mr. Jones is the President of the U.S.-Cuba Trade Association. And next to Mr. Jones, to his right, left rather, would be Ambassador James Cason. Ambassador Cason is the president of the Center for Free Cuba, and he's the former principal officer, chief of mission for U.S. Interest Section in Havana. I want to welcome all of you witnesses, and it is the practice of this subcommittee, a new practice I might add, to swear in the witnesses. So I would ask that you stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please let the records reflect that all witnesses have answered in the affirmative and have taken their seats. We will allow you 5 minutes for the purposes of opening statements, and we'll begin with you, Mrs. Rothkopf. Thank you. Please put a mic close to you and make sure that it's on. Is your mic on?
Thank you. We applaud the recent moves by both Congress and the Obama administration to ease the embargo on Cuba. The Chamber sees recent bipartisan legislation and statements by the administration as important first steps toward a policy more likely to promote a transition to democracy and full civil liberties in Cuba and bring significant economic opportunities to American farmers, businesses, and workers. But ultimately, what we would like to see is an end to the embargo, which we view as one of the biggest foreign policy failures of the past half-century. Rather than encouraging Cuba to democratize, the embargo has helped prop up the communist regime. Instead of isolating Cuba from the rest of the world, it has isolated the United States from our allies. Our two countries are natural trading partners, and prior to the embargo, the United States accounted for nearly 70% of Cuba's international trade. Cuba was the 7th largest market for U.S. exporters, particularly for American farm producers, but the embargo forced Cuba to seek out new sources for its domestic consumption. Under the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000, the sale of commercial agricultural exports was permitted, but with a variety of restrictions and licensing requirements, including cash and advance payments via third country banks. Despite heavy regulation, by 2004, U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba rose from less than 1 million to 392 million, 42% of the Cuban market. In 2008, U.S. exports to Cuba reached 718 million. Yet the majority of agricultural trade with Cuba is done by large multinational companies, as small and medium-sized exporters are deterred by the complexity of regulations. Other negative impacts on food and agricultural exports include restrictions on the ability to travel for the purpose of establishing commercial relationships, and restrictions on visits from Cuban officials to confer with U.S. suppliers, inspect facilities, and discuss sanitary and phytosanitary issues. In 2001, the International Trade Commission estimated that the embargo cost U.S. exporters up to $1.2 billion annually in lost sales. While the U.S. Chamber recommends that an updated study be conducted to fully evaluate the missed opportunities, it is clear that these include agriculture. The ITC estimates that if all restrictions on trade and travel are lifted, sales in poultry, beef, and pork could rise by 25.7 to 37.8 million. Additionally, Cuba has the potential to become the top foreign market for U.S. rice. A Congressional Research Service study estimates that removing restrictions on trade would increase rice exports by 14 to 43 million. Tourism. Lifting the travel ban will create jobs in the U.S. and Cuban tourism industries and will have an impact on direct investment in tourism infrastructure, such as hotels, shops, cruise ship ports, airports. The ITC estimates that lifting the travel ban would increase U.S. visitors to Cuba from 171,000 in 2005 to between 554,000 and 1.1 million. Additional tourist arrivals would increase U.S. sales of agricultural goods to the island because of the increased tourist demand for food and because of higher Cuban economic growth, boosting domestic demand for high-quality U.S. food products. Machinery. As Cuba rebuilds after widespread hurricane and tropical storm damage in 2008, the island is an important potential market for construction equipment and agricultural machinery. Additionally, Cuba has a dilapidated infrastructure system. An eventual opening or reform of the Cuban economy will create opportunities for U.S.-made equipment to build the island's infrastructure. Oil. There is a natural niche for U.S. oil companies to participate in the exploration of Cuban offshore oil fields. Subsurface similarities with existing oil fields in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico would allow U.S. companies that have experience in the Gulf to mitigate complicated technical challenges in local deepwater development, leading to cost, environmental, and safety efficiencies. Additionally, Cuba's proximity to the U.S. allows for a transportation cost premium for the U.S. market that would serve to moderate energy prices to the United States. At the same time, with Cuba's maritime boundary just 45 miles away from the U.S. coastline, we ought to be concerned about who and how Cuba's oil fields are being developed from an environmental standpoint, as an oil spill could mean significant environmental damage for the United States. We believe that opening trade with Cuba will bring political and economic change to the island, but establishing a commercial relationship will certainly raise legitimate business concerns on the part of U.S. companies. The Cuban government will have to provide certain guarantees and safeguards in the areas of rule of law, environmental protection, infrastructure for travel requirements, the safety environment, intellectual property protection and incentives for innovation, and labor rights. Additionally, there are important considerations regarding financing. However, these concerns should not impede a lifting of trade restrictions with Cuba. U.S. businesses can quickly and easily benefit from open trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now the chair recognizes Mr. Thalley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jeff Thale, the Program Director of the Washington Office on Latin America. WOL is a human rights organization, and we look at Latin America policy and the Cuba policy from the perspective of human rights. I've submitted written testimony, but here I'd just like to briefly summarize it. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about whether, from our point of view, trade can contribute to improvement in the human rights situation in Cuba, and if so, how. And then I'd like to end by reiterating what I think you'll hear from some of my other colleagues here about the trade opportunities and investment opportunities we're losing. As an organization, as an institution, we don't believe that trade by itself in Cuba or anywhere else automatically brings gains and increases in democracy and human rights. But when trade is part of a broader strategy that includes diplomatic and political engagement on human rights issues, and when there are internal and domestic pressures for the respect of human rights, then there are possibilities to see improvements in the human rights situation. In the case of Cuba, we believe strongly that increased trade, increased travel, and engagement can only benefit the human rights situation in Cuba and bring benefits to the United States as well. Let me just say a word about the human rights situation itself. It's easy, it's very tempting to view the human rights situation in Cuba from sort of stereotypical points of view. It's extremely important not to whitewash the very serious and very real problems. It's important not to exaggerate them as well. I think it's really clear if you look at the State Department's human rights reports, there are real restrictions on freedom of association, on freedom of speech. It's very clear that Cuba holds between 100 and 200 political prisoners, depending on how you count it. These are all clearly unacceptable violations of internationally recognized norms. The U.S. government should call on the Cubans to end that. the human rights community should, the international community should generally. At the same time, we look at human rights in the rest of Latin America, and if you look further at those same State Department reports, you won't see reports of political killings in Cuba or political disappearances or extrajudicial executions, which we see elsewhere in the region, and you won't see systematic accusations of torture, which is obviously an issue we've looked at in the Guantanamo context here. So I think from our point of view, it's important to see the mixed bag you see in Cuba on the human rights situation. If you ask about the United States' ability to influence the human rights situation in Cuba itself, I think from our point of view, our ability is non-existent. We've had 50 years of an embargo, almost 50 years of an embargo, little trade with some narrow exceptions, limited contact, limited diplomacy, and the result is we have very little influence and very little leverage. Cuba is free to ignore our views on human rights because we don't make much significant difference to the government or its economy or its politics or its diplomacy. And so our view is that engagement would change that. By engaging through trade, by engaging through travel, by engaging through diplomacy, we'll develop relationships in Cuba over time, and we'll develop tools over time that can be used to dialogue with and to encourage greater respect from the Cuban government over human rights and democratic practices. And I don't think that's a magical formula. We're not going to see change overnight. We're not going to see dramatic steps from today to tomorrow. But it's clearly a better strategy to pursue engagement, including trade, travel, and diplomacy, than it is to continue the current embargo. And I think it's important to underscore that's a point of view that most of the world believes. Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa, most of the Middle Eastern countries all engaged with Cuba. Some key allies and partners of ours, especially Brazil and the Spanish government, systematically engaged with the Cuban government on trade issues and link that to dialogue on human rights, democracy issues, political prisoners. And again, I don't think they expect dramatic change overnight. They see themselves as laying the groundwork, as preparing for the future, and as developing relationships there. And the truth is the United States is standing on the sidelines. And we're standing on the sidelines at a time when we have economic reasons to engage with Cuba. You know, as Ms. Rothkopf mentioned, as I assume Mr. Jones will mention as well, there are agricultural interests and agricultural possibilities in Cuba. There are interests from our ports in the Gulf Coast. There are tourism and travel interests. There are medical interests and medical opportunities. There are potential energy interests. There's a whole set of economic opportunities that we're foregoing for the sake of a policy that's not bringing us any real benefit in terms of human rights and democracy. So I think our view is that we ought to move toward a policy of engagement, that policy ought to include moving toward ending our embargo on trade and taking advantage of the opportunity that brings us there. We're pleased to see that President Obama has taken the first initial steps in that process. We're pleased, Mr. Chairman, to see that you traveled to Cuba recently, engaged in the beginnings of dialogue and diplomacy here. We hope we'll move forward in that way because we think it's good for human rights in Cuba as well as good for the United States. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Jones for the 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here as well. For the last 47 years, the cornerstone of U.S. policy toward Cuba has been the embargo. But if one looks at the original and subsequent reasons for this policy, it is hard, if not impossible, to point to a single success that this policy has had in achieving any of its objectives. The embargo has achieved, in fact, the exact opposite of what was originally intended and is not serving the interests of the United States government nor of the United States citizens. No other country in the world has an embargo on Cuba. I have been traveling back and forth to Cuba for 35 years, and I've seen a lot of changes in those years. It may be that the U.S. policy has been stuck for 47 years, but Cuba has not. A new trade and investment economy has emerged in Cuba the last 15 years, a mix of capitalism and socialism, and not just a little dose of capitalism. Every sector in Cuba now has a foreign private investor. This includes mining, energy, hotels, beer, bottled water, port management, cosmetics, biotechnology, real estate, agribusiness, and telecommunications, just to name a few. Cuba has removed subsidies from almost all its former state enterprises and merged or eliminated ministries. To undertake its foreign business, Cuba has created dozens of freestanding holding companies. Where once totally dependent on sugar, Cuba has greatly diversified its source of revenues now to include nickel exports, personal services, tourism, foreign remittances, citrus and seafood exports, worldwide sales of rum and cigars, and exports of biotechnology products. Whatever adjectives serve those who continue to want us to believe that Cuba is on the brink of economic collapse, the reality is otherwise. Having said that, like all developing countries, Cuba does have many problems. Major foreign debt obligations, foreign currency exchange regulations are shifting, domestic pricing policies for imported consumer food products have inhibited market growth, labor regulations need improvement, transparency regarding foreign investment is a long-standing concern, and limits are placed on entrepreneurial expansion. But Cuba is also the largest country in the Caribbean, with a size comparable to Pennsylvania. According to both CIA and the Economist Intelligence Unit, Cuba has had growth rates of 10.2% annually from 2005 to 2007. This has fallen to 4.4% in 2008 due to the worldwide recession and devastating hurricanes. Largely unknown is that Cuba has the third largest deposits of nickel in the world and is the ninth largest tourist destination in the Americas without any Americans. I first met Fidel Castro in 1974. I have known him now for 35 years. All of these changes in the way Cuba now does business were initiated under Fidel Castro, but are now not dependent on him or Raul Castro. For they have already implemented much of the very transition that some still say would come only after Castro no longer heads Cuba. To wait to lift the embargo for some so-called post-Castro era, as if all will change and somehow different, is not at all a productive business plan, nor, quite frankly, is it a productive political strategy either. After 40 years of no trade and just a bit over 7 years, the U.S. now supplies, as has been mentioned several times, more food to Cuba than any other country. In 2008, U.S. companies received $718 million from the sale of agricultural products to Cuba. In aggregate, since this trade began, contracts for more than 11 million metric tons worth over $3.6 billion, including shipping and services, have been signed, comprising 300 different products, including wheat, rice, corn, soybeans, tomato sauce, eggs, chicken, cookies, apples, wine, ground turkey, chewing gum, utility poles, live cattle, organic fertilizer, and rice. These have been bought from 157 different companies from 37 states. 23 different ports have been used for more than 1,100 ship journeys, of which 73.5% have been made with U.S.-owned or chartered vessels. But U.S. companies are forced to operate under a serious disadvantage in comparison to companies from other countries. The rulings in early 2005 by the previous administration have caused Cuba to cut back on some imports from the United States. Most important in preventing U.S. companies from the full realization of their current trade has been and is the inability to offer private credits. There are some who argue that this restriction should be maintained because they feel Cuba is a bad credit risk. But whether or not to extend private credit to Cuba should be a decision taken by each company, not by the U.S. government. If these restrictions, unique in international commerce, were lifted, Pedro Alvarez, chairman and CEO of Allenport, which imports all U.S. agricultural products to Cuba, has stated that U.S. firms could provide over 50% of Cuba's food needs, which annually reach almost $2 billion, which would be an increase of several $100 million a year over current levels. There have been studies that indicate that U.S. firms have lost over $100 billion since the early 60s because of the embargo, and that the annual cost now could be as high as $4 billion a year. In my opinion, the key to starting a process of business with Cuba which will benefit American workers and the U.S. economy will be for Congress to pass and for the President to sign H.R. 874 and S. 428, which will allow all Americans to travel to Cuba. 2 million Americans are projected to visit Cuba in the first 2 years of open travel. Studies have shown that this in turn would result in an injection of $1.6 billion into the U.S. travel and support service industry, and most of that helping the small to medium-sized travel agents, airlines, additional food exports to feed the U.S. visitors, and advertising and promotional programs. Virtually anything that Cuba now purchases might very well be purchased from the United States. In this list of potential products, I am including fertilizers and pesticides, pharmaceutical products, textiles and apparel, steel, farm machinery and construction equipment, power generation machinery, electronics, plastics, tires, and sporting goods. Services such as air transportation, maritime transportation, construction service, telecommunications and travel and tourism, and of course a growth in the importation of U.S. agriculture.
Would you please summarize your statement, please?
U.S. firms will be able to offer what companies from Europe, Canada, and Latin America can never provide. And finally, in addition to sales, there would be several opportunities for investment: agribusiness, hotels, marinas, golf resorts, housing and building renovation, telecommunications, and overall infrastructure. These are just some of the opportunities that will be open. I'll be glad to take any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Ambassador Kaysen. Ambassador Kaysen, you're recognized for 5 minutes, more or less.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss this topic of great importance. Until very recently, I was a career Foreign Service officer with 38 years experience, mostly in Latin America. One of my postings was to Cuba, where I was chief of mission from late 2002 to late 2005. I'm speaking here today as president of the Center for a Free Cuba, a nonpartisan NGO and a 501c3 organization, and therefore nothing I say here today supports or opposes any bill before Congress, and we administer a USAID grant. We at the Center for a Free Cuba provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Cuba and assist civil society and democratic activists there. We send uncensored information and shortwave radios, among other things, to Cuba. The Center favors licensing measures announced by the President that will allow U.S. firms to attempt to enter the Cuban telecommunications market. Havana limits its citizens' access to the Internet, cell phones, and other information, or media out of its control. If Cuba expands the speed and availability of the Internet, lowers the exorbitant cost of Internet cafes, Cubans will communicate faster and more easily among each other and with the wider world. Greater access to and use of the Internet by average Cubans, especially the young, will promote civil society and the democratic process there. We support Cuban-American travel to the island on humanitarian grounds and travel by researchers, academics, and others who make a serious effort to discover for themselves Cuba's reality. We are opposed to tourist travel by American citizens with no relatives on the island because such travel will only provide funds to the Cuban security apparatus which owns the tourist infrastructure. Such bathing suit tourism will do nothing for Cubans, nor will it in any way help promote democracy. Mr. Chairman, I would like now to ask that a recent paper I wrote entitled "The Case Against Travel to Cuba" be entered into the record.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. Just as we oppose unprincipled tourist travel to Cuba, we do not feel that a unilateral ending of what remains of the embargo now will promote greater economic or political freedom in Cuba or great benefit to American companies. Lech Walesa and Havel told the Center recently that nowhere in the world have authoritarian regimes changed their ways because of trade or tourism. It has been international solidarity, constant pressure, and tangible and moral support for democratic freedom fighters that have made the difference. When the Castros are gone, the embargo will serve as leverage in helping the military owners of hotels realize it is in their interest to support a democratic opening. For if they do, we can provide millions of tourist dollars in trade opportunities. As the Washington Post has recently editorialized, giving away what little leverage we have for nothing now will gain us nothing and will harm those fighting for change on the island. Please note that all the rest of the world trades and allows travel to Cuba, but that has not made any difference in the totalitarian nature of the regime. As long as Cuba refuses to allow independent labor unions the right to exist, we oppose U.S. businesses entering into joint venture arrangements with the Cuban government. Havana exploits workers and takes 95% of what joint venture partners pay the government for labor. Strikes are not permitted, and many independent labor organizers have been given long prison sentences. To invest in Cuba today is to participate in the exploitation of defenseless Cuban workers. And I would not be surprised if after freedom comes to Cuba, there's a backlash against Canadian, Spanish, and other investors who have taken advantage of docile Cuban labor to make a fast buck. American farmers are privileged in their dealings with Cuba. They get cash and take no credit risk. As we've heard, we are the largest food provider to Cuba. Why would any agribusiness exporter want to give credit to Cuba? Why would American citizens support such a measure when Cuba is an international deadbeat? It has defaulted many times and owes foreign creditors over $25 billion, not to mention another $22 billion of unpaid Cold War-era debt. Its economy is moribund, and it is in arrears everywhere. Per capita, Cuba owes $4,000 each. Its debt equals 86% of GDP. It's the 10th most indebted country in the world, and its Moody's credit rating is CAA1, speculative grade, very poor. Dun & Bradstreet rate Cuba as one of the riskiest economies in the world. I would note that Cubans' average monthly wage is around $20. The average Cuban lacks money for most necessities. U.S. food goes largely to the tourist industry, or is marked up 256% and sold to those who receive remittances in dollar stores. There is no consumer demand for our products and no prospects in sight for this to change until the regime begins to pursue free market economic policies. There are no Cuban entrepreneurs, no free market policies, no economic opportunity, and no purchasing power. There's just the regime which resists change in a panicky attempt to maintain total power for the nomenclatura. Reuters reported last week that there is a severe cash crunch in Cuba, and foreign businessmen fear Cuba could be near insolvency. The liquidity crisis has become critical. Small foreign businesses are reportedly desperate and are not being paid. State companies have been ordered to stop all imports. Prices and demand for all Cuban exports are down, and nothing suggests Cuba's economy will get any better soon. Now, recent polls conducted in Cuba reveal that only 6% there of the citizens see the embargo as a problem. What they most want is for the government to give them a better life, a decent job, hope for the future. They say they want change, democracy, and economic freedom. They want elections. They want to join the world. They want to be able to travel and run their own businesses in Cuba. Whether the U.S. trades more with Cuba is irrelevant to their lives. Center for a Free Cuba opposes any loosening of restrictions on commerce with Cuba now for the following 5 reasons. Trade and tourism will not hasten a democratic transition there. Cuba is a terrible credit risk and cannot pay most of its bills. It exploits its workers shamelessly. It's an insignificant market for U.S. consumer and other goods, and only the government, not the people, benefits from trade with us. There are no Cuban exporters or entrepreneurs. Mr. Chairman, only if and when a new Cuban leadership demonstrates through deeds, not words, as the President has said, that it is moving toward democracy and market freedoms, then we will be among the first to say, let's deal. Thank you very much for allowing me to testify here today.
The chair thanks the gentleman.